Awesome. And I'm going to stop my share for just a moment and then we'll get started. Okay, last couple people off of the waiting room. And yeah, if you have any friends that are not going to be able to make the meeting tonight, I did send it out in the email today, but this recording will end up on the YouTube playlist as well. So I think we'll get started just so we can not go over time. Thanks for coming out tonight. My name's Shannon Regan. I'm the education coordinator for the Friends of GNFAC. If you watch the pre-course videos, I recorded two of the videos. And for some of you coming out this weekend, I'll be up on Saturday. So I'll see some of you on the course. And I think with that, I'm just going to share my screen because I have a couple field day reminders and then we'll dive into the recap. But for anyone who's just tuning in for questions, just go ahead and unmute yourself. And ask your question, or you can drop it in the chat box if you really don't want to talk. So those are going to be the best ways to ask questions. And I will basically, like throughout the presentation, here we go. Someone raised a hand, so I'm going to ask you to unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, am I unmuted now?
Yep.
Awesome. Yeah, it shows Steve, but I'm actually Julius.
Oh.
But anyways, me and my friend we're joining the field day on Sunday, and we're exchange students at MSU. So unfortunately, we do not have a car, and I wanted to ask into the round here if anybody is open to carpool with us and maybe give us a ride there and back. That would be really, really great and greatly appreciated if anybody could stop by Johnstone Center.
Yeah, and Steve, the other thing I can offer is I could just put your contact info out there to the course list for Sunday.
Oh yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, so if you don't mind doing that, can you just drop your name and contact info in the chat and I'll just grab it that way.
Yeah.
And
sure.
then I'll just put it out to the Sunday group. That might be the best way to get you a ride.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for asking and testing the hand raise.
Seems to be working.
Cool.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so I think we'll get started here. So I'll share my screen again. Cool. So you should see the screen that says Zoom reminders again, and we'll just dive in from here. So, okay, so this is just a recap with the Q&A, and we're just going to start with some pre-course information. So, kind of most important before the course is just making sure you've looked over the gear list and you filled out a waiver. I know we end up sending you a lot of information ahead of these courses. That's just because there's a lot of information we want you all to know ahead of time. And if you do have any questions, please reach out to the Friends of GNFAC Gmail and someone will answer your questions. And where we're meeting, the Jim Bridger Lodge Sun Deck. So Bridger Bowl isn't open this weekend, like I said in the email, and moving things around on my screen really quick and I got distracted. Okay, there we go. I had a weird presenter view field that went away from me. But yeah, so we're meeting at Bridger at the Jim Bridger Lodge Sun Deck. So that's going to be the lodge that's like directly uphill of the end of the parking lot of the end of the road. It's got the big staircase in front of it. And then we'll be on the sun deck that's on the back side and meeting at 9 a.m. And that's like boots on, ready to go at 9 a.m. Oh, sweet. Saw Julius's chat. Thank you. Yeah, so meet at 9 a.m. and like really try to be on time because any minutes that we're late kind of start adding up, and it's harder to accomplish all of our goals for the field day if people are late. So what to expect in the morning, we'll go over reading, avalanche forecasts, trip planning, talking about avalanche terrain, snowpack, and snow observations. And then in the afternoon, we'll cover avalanche rescue, travel practices, and debriefing and your next steps in education. And the afternoon, we really try to focus on getting everyone good practice with avalanche rescue. Obviously, that's a little bit limited right now because of the amount of snow we have on the ground. Like, luckily, we have enough snow to ski and ride, but there's not very much snow, so it's not going to be very good digging practice. So we'll just make do with the snow we have, and we'll do really good beacon drills for people. Sweet. Are there any questions specific to the field days? And if you have a question that bubbles up over the course of the Q&A, feel free to ask. You can also just direct those questions to the Friends of GNFAC Gmail too, if you have any. Cool. Okay, I think we'll just dive on in then. So when we look at the video series, we covered kind of the intro to avalanches and the intro to the series. We covered terrain, weather, snowpack, risk management, and avalanche rescue. And so this recap's going to kind of go in that series, and I'll pause between topics to see if there's any questions. And the goal with us doing these pre-course meetings is to have an opportunity to answer people's questions and to give them a review. There are likely some people who maybe didn't watch all of the videos. We know it's a lot of pre-course work. Those videos are meant to be a resource. Like, that's why we put them up on YouTube for free, as anyone can watch them. And we really think that the value is watching them ahead of the field day, so you can come in with questions and more context. Okay, so when we think about the big picture, in that intro presentation, we talked about how the majority of fatal avalanche accidents are caused by the person or someone in their party. And what that really means for avalanche risk is we have a natural hazard, avalanches, and then we have how humans interact with the hazard, and that's what creates risk ultimately. And that's why avalanche education is an effective tool for people to protect themselves against the bad consequences of avalanches, because we can make some decisions that really impact our, how at risk we are. So in the United States, got distracted by the chat. In the United States, there's an average of 27 fatalities a year. The picture on the screen is a fatal avalanche that was in West Yellowstone. So it doesn't take much for an avalanche to be a fatal avalanche. So in the series, we really want to start thinking about what avalanches are and why they're so dangerous. So we're going to jump right on in with talking about the different types of avalanches. We can have loose snow avalanches that are because snow isn't cohesive with the snow around it. Usually the surface snow isn't cohesive with what's under it, and that's why it's running down the mountain. We can have slab avalanches, and that is cohesive snow or slab that's over underlying weak layer. And slab avalanches, particularly dry slab avalanches, are kind of like the most dangerous to us. So kind of the first element, we talked about like the ingredients of what a slab avalanche needs. And slab avalanches need to have steep enough slopes, a layered snowpack, and a trigger. And so the kind of foundation of what causes avalanches is going to be terrain. And that's where we'll start with the recap. So when we think about avalanche paths, an avalanche terrain is really going to be defined as anywhere where an avalanche can start, run, and stop. And so when we look at this picture, The start zone is those steep slopes, those slopes steeper than 30 degrees. The track is going to be the terrain that's fall line beneath the start zone. And the run out is going to be where the avalanche ultimately, like the debris ends up and the avalanche stops because it runs out of steam, basically. And for avalanche paths, the size of a path could be determined by like the depth of the snowpack or the depth of the layer that the avalanche fails on. So, you know, I think it's often like you can look at a big avalanche path like this, and maybe not every single day could an avalanche actually run all the way to the run out zone that's marked in this, but it's really important for us to recognize these different parts of avalanche terrain. And it's not just the steep slope. So I know this slide says terrain basics, and then there's a whole bunch of different things on it. Um, the terrain video walked through all these things more in depth. I think for the recap level, like what we're really concerned with is like, okay, what are we defining as avalanche terrain? And as far as those start zones, those are the areas where we're going to trigger an avalanche. And that's going to be most avalanches have start zones of 30 to 45 degrees. And looking at a picture like this, the kind of most common start zone angle is going to be in the upper 30s, but 30 and up is the really simple definition for, most avalanches occur on 30 and steeper. But we want to expand the definition of avalanche terrain to also include the terrain that's connected to that steep slope. So it's bringing it back to avalanche terrain is where avalanches start, run, and stop. And I think what's really important is we can't make different choices for ourselves or make lower risk choices if we can't identify avalanche terrain. And identifying avalanche terrain is all about just asking yourself questions when you're out in the mountains, like, could an avalanche start here? Is this terrain capable of producing an avalanche, or is the terrain above me capable of producing an avalanche? What happens if there's an avalanche here? And then, like, what can we do about it? What choices can we make to reduce our exposure to that terrain while also still going and skiing or riding or like accomplishing an objective? Some other stuff that we're going to touch on in the course is talking about terrain traps. We can talk about, kind of visual indicators of avalanche paths. And we're going to give you tools. We're going to work with inclinometers, like whether it's in your phone or we have some BCA plastic ones to give out too. So we're going to give you some tools to practice determining how steep a slope is, whether you're on it or you're sighting out to a slope that you're not on, and then using those like vegetative clues and your common sense to determine what avalanche terrain is, because that's really the whole foundation of safe travel practices is being able to identify avalanche terrain. And I think like we'll talk about it a little bit more, but we repeatedly see in accidents that maybe people aren't fully identifying how consequential avalanche terrain can be. And that's something that's really dangerous for people. Okay, any questions about terrain specifically? Cool. Okay, I think we'll move on. So the next kind of foundational component in the like big question of what are avalanches or what do you need to have avalanches, we're going to talk a bit about mountain weather. And we're going to consider that weather is the architect of our snowpack. So in Zach's talk about weather, and it really connects well with Erica's snowpack lecture, is that mountain weather is what's creating a layered snowpack. And a layered snowpack is what we need to have avalanches. So what's really important for us to understand is what specific weather is causing or contributing to avalanches and what weather also contributes to different layers in the snowpack. So I think snowfall is like the most obvious weather factor that contributes to avalanches. The majority of avalanches are happening during or right after a storm. So it's like a really easy correlation. more snow equals more avalanches. I know that that seems kind of wild to like think about for last year. Like we didn't have very much snow in Southwest Montana, and it we had like a really bad avalanche year. But it was like all the avalanches started happening after it started finally snowing. Um, and last year was like an exceptionally poor snowpack year. And so it kind of flies in the face of like you need a lot of snow to have avalanches. But what's most important with snowfall is like not necessarily how much depth of snow, but how much weight of water it was. Um, so if you're from like a coastal climate, the snow can often be much wetter, it's much heavier, and that's going to be a bigger weight or load on the slope. And when the snowpack changes rapidly, it doesn't like rapid change, and you're going to be more likely to see avalanches with a really rapid change like that. So the other major weather factor, and this is like a big one in Montana, obviously, because it can be really windy here, is how much the wind is influencing the snowpack. So looking at this picture, we have a couple different like indicators of wind effect on this slope. And the kind of bottom line with wind affected snow is wind can transport snow something like 10 times faster than it can fall out of the sky, which I think is kind of a hard thing to um, measure, but it's like really easy to see up on a ridge line, like how much snow can get transported onto one side of the ridge, like up in the Bridgers. You can see these really big cornices and these really wind loaded slopes. And this picture just has some cool examples of what that wind loading can look like. Um, and kind of a note about cornices is that like I think we get really comfortable walking near cornices. Like if you ski on the ridge at a place like Bridger Bowl, people are just kind of used to being around cornices. But in the backcountry, cornices can be pretty unstable and can break farther back than you'd expect and kind of be their own hazard. But often underneath cornices, you're going to see wind pillowing. So those kind of like big wind loaded slopes, and that's going to be a spot where you're likely to trigger a wind slab avalanche. So the other major weather factor is going to be temperature, and I kind of already hinted at this with our snowfall is our temperatures can really dictate like what kind of snow is falling, and we can get those different melt freeze layers like what we have right now, where we got a fair bit of snow at the beginning of or at the middle of November, and then it's been kind of dry for I don't know the last week or so. It's been hot and dry, and so we have snow that's melting and refreezing, and then it also can make a really big difference in a storm if you have cold snow that gets buried underneath wetter snow. And Erica talked about that in her snowpack talk a bit more. The other thing that temperature really makes a big difference on is in our kind of spring snowpack, but we also have been having like big temperature fluctuations in the middle of the season the last handful of years. Like last year in like January and February, we had some really hot days. When you warm up a dry, cold snowpack rapidly, you get liquid water in it, and that destabilizes the snowpack. And so you see things like these roller balls in the picture, or you start seeing loose avalanches or even wet slab avalanches. So non-freezing temperatures after, um, you have a dry snowpack and then you get non-freezing above freezing temperatures. That's a pretty big red flag. Cool. So the kind of major takeaways from the weather talk were like, okay, so what do we do about it? Like we want to access weather forecasts, whether that's through the National Weather Service or whatever apps people like using. You can also access those forecasts. Like MT Avalanche just has a mountain weather forecast at the start of their avalanche forecasts. So then, we do our homework before going out because we want to know what it's like. Like you want to know whether or not you need to pack an extra jacket. You also want to know if there's any obvious like red flags going into the day. Like say it says it's going to be really windy. That's something to pay attention to. Um, and then in the field, you want to just be on the lookout for these red flags. So that's going to look like if you're out and it's heavily snowing, or if there's strong winds, or there's a rapid above freezing temperature shift. And you want to use those red flags, and we'll talk about this later in the decision making and risk management recap, is like you want to use those red flags to default to making more conservative decisions, because those are all indicators that the snow could be unstable, or that you have some of the ingredients to have an avalanche present. Okay, any questions specifically about weather? Okay, here's a question. Is gusting or sustained winds more concerning? And is there a minimum wind speed threshold for wind loading? Yeah, it's generally around 15 miles an hour and up is kind of when we start seeing more than just surface load, like small surface loading or saltation, where I think everyone's seen this, where like the snow is just right on the surface, kind of moving around. Above 15 miles an hour, you actually see snow getting picked up and moved. And I think there's not an easy answer to gusting versus sustained. I think anytime you see gusts that are over 15, you can expect wind loading. You just see wind loading in different patterns based on if it's gusting or sustained, or if you have really high winds. Like if you get high enough winds, the snow is not actually being retransported onto the slopes nearby. It's actually like it could just go into the air and sublimate. So it really depends on like the wind speed, and your patterns of wind loading might change. So wind's pretty complicated. Like you're out skiing enough, you can see, even if you're skiing at a resort, you can see the kind of different wind loading patterns based on the wind speed, and it's going to be really localized too. Awesome question. Okay, so I think we'll dive into the snowpack recap. So the start of the snowpack talk, Erica also brought up the different types of avalanches. The main avalanche type that we're going to focus on in this course and in the field day when we look at snow is slab avalanches, specifically dry slab avalanches. Wet snow avalanches are pretty complicated, and it is something we deal with as backcountry skiers and riders. And like we might even see a little bit on Saturday because it's going to be hot. But for the most part, like most recreational avalanche accidents are happening because of dry slab avalanches. So that's why we have so much focus on them. And like part of what's dangerous about the dry slab avalanches is how they can break wide across slopes and they can break above people, versus those loose avalanches are generally breaking underfoot or near someone. So it can be a bit easier to escape that avalanche or stop yourself on a slope. So the recipe again is you need steep enough terrain, and you need a layered snowpack with a slab on top of a weak layer of snow, and then a trigger. And that trigger is most of the time us. We could also be seeing like naturally triggered avalanches where you have enough snow loading or wind loading that the avalanche releases without any extra weight. You can also have, animal triggered avalanches, explosive triggered avalanches. Like last year, there was a mountain goat at Big Sky that triggered an avalanche and was okay, walked off of it. You can also remotely trigger avalanches where you're not directly on the slope, but you collapse a slope and that collapse travels up a slope. And we had a lot of those in the area last year, just because we had such an unstable snowpack. So yeah, the kind of important thing with our layered snowpack is that we have different types of storms that create different layers and different weather events that create different layers. So right now we have this period of sustained high pressure, so no precipitation, limited cloud cover, and we are changing the layers of the snowpack. But most of the time those like the different layers of snowpack are going to be like you get a couple inches from a storm, you get some wind blowing the snow and compacting it. You have a melt freeze crust, like all these complicated layers that stack up on top of each other. Unfortunately, for our field day, we're not going to have a super complicated layered snowpack just because we don't have that much snow on the ground yet this year. Um, but Erica had mentioned the different temperatures of snow and different types of snow that can fall. Um, and and she did hint a little bit about like the how the snow changes over time and how snow can become the grains of snow can become larger or faceted. And those faceted grains of snow are often what we have at the base of our snowpack, and those are often what are causing the persistent um, instabilities or persistent slab problems. And because it's been so warm at lower elevations, like at Bridger, we haven't been seeing super faceted snow yet this season. But it doesn't take that drastic of cold temperatures, like cold, clear nights, like what we've been having, are kind of what forms these faceted layers, or eventually the depth hoar. So I think for the purposes of this course, it's like maybe not that important that we can recognize like specific types of snow grains when we see them, but it's more important to be able to recognize the difference between layers. And that's kind of what this slide gets to, is like what we're really looking at is like the ingredients for an avalanche. We need to have something, so a slab over nothing, or hard over soft. Or if you have soft snow and even softer snow, that's also that's a bad recipe. Um, and like usually for stable snow, right side up snow, we want the soft snow on the very surface and the harder snow under it. I'm gonna pop over and see if we had a question. Ooh, this is a great question. Are smaller snow molecules generally better than large ones? So snow, when it falls from the sky, we often refer to as like snow crystals. And once they are on the ground, they're snow grains. And the snow grains, when they are smaller, they can get packed in tighter. So like that really good snowball making snow, snow that wants to be cohesive. A good example of snow that's strong is actually wind slab. So when wind transports snow, it breaks it into tiny pieces and it sticks well with the other snow. So it's like really tightly packed snow grains versus the persistent weak layers we're talking about are bigger grains, and they're not as cohesive with the other grains because there's more airspace between the big grains of snow. So yeah, generally speaking, the smaller the grains, the more strong they can be. But really, to have the avalanche, you need to have avalanches, you need to have the layers and to have the difference in layers. That makes sense. So, like, I guess the good example I'd use is in the springtime, once you have liquid water run all the way through a snowpack, like say it's May, and the snow grains are much more tightly packed. And that's a good example of like a strong snowpack, one that doesn't have layers with big grains in it. Oh, here's another good question. If you're traveling in sub 30-degree terrain, can you still remote trigger an avalanche above you? And the answer is yes. So if you are on a low angle slope and you're connected to a steeper slope, you could trigger an avalanche that is above you and comes down on you. You could also trigger an avalanche remotely on a flat slope, and that collapse of the snowpack could travel up a slope. And it depends on how close you are to the steep slope, whether or not, you'd be involved in that avalanche. But yeah, that's a great question. Okay, so back to the snowpack. So that's kind of the basics of layers of snow. And then a really important thing that Erica talked about in her segment is introducing avalanche problem types. And why we made the decision to include that in this course was because most avalanche forecast products use avalanche problems to communicate. We basically characterize avalanches by patterns. Like, so we use pattern recognition of like the characteristics of these avalanches. So when we look at these different avalanche problem types, in the circles here are all the dry slab avalanches. And what's really important to recognize is the characteristics of these avalanches might be different. So the difference between the persistent slab or the deep persistent slab versus a wind slab or a storm slab can be quite like astonishing. So just because they're dry slab avalanches doesn't mean they're all the same. So these wind slab and storm slab avalanches are generally characterized by what's called direct action. So snow falls from the sky or it's directly windy, and that's what's causing the instability. And when the snow stops falling or it stops being windy, the instability will go away. With persistent slab avalanches, the what's causing the instability is having a slab on top of these persistent grain types, so these facets or the depth or those, you know, big grains of snow that can persist for a really long period of time. Like last winter, we had these, you know, persistent slab avalanches that persisted for so like the whole season long and became these deep slab avalanches. And the characteristics of persistent slab avalanches that are so dangerous are that you could put, you know, 100 skiers on a slope and they may not find the right place to trigger that avalanche. Versus if you have a storm slab, like say it's been snowing a lot, and the first skier you put on that slope, if there's unstable layering, is likely to trigger that avalanche. So that's like a pretty big difference. And I think that's why it's really important that we talk about that in this course. Is like we live in a snowpack that has persistent weak layers in it most of the time. So it's important to recognize those differences. Awesome. So to kind of recap the snowpack talk, honestly, like people spend their whole careers working in snow and working with avalanches and studying snow. And it's a really complicated field that I think can people like really want to get sucked into it and learn a lot about it. But ultimately, what's important to recognize is the layering that can cause avalanches and be able to see it in the field or be able to read an avalanche forecast and know what to expect based on what you're reading. So being able to use those avalanche problems to have a better understanding of what's going on when you're about to go out into the backcountry, or being able to look at the snow and the weather and be like, oh, what's it gonna be like out there? And that's not just for like knowing if you should avoid steep slopes because there's a lot of avalanche hazard. It might even just be to know where the good skiing is. So stuff like that. This is an area, I feel like this topic people generally have a lot of questions about. So I'll just open it up to see if anyone has any more questions about snowpack. Make sure I'm not missing anyone who is raising their hand. Okay, cool. So no questions. Okay, so we've covered kind of the terrain, weather, and snowpack. And I think the really important part, and this is why this part of the recap is going to be a bit longer, the really important component is like, okay, how do humans interact with the avalanche phenomena? And so we already started with the recap about the actual hazard. So like when we know more about avalanches, we can keep ourselves a bit safer from them. And really like where the kind of the meat of avalanche education and awareness comes in is knowing what choices we have and what tools we have to make safe decisions out there. So I think it's really important to recognize that like we get to dictate our exposure and vulnerability, but I also think, you know, there are a lot of avalanche accidents, especially accidents with people who have avalanche training and have the knowledge. And so I think it can be a lot harder to execute than just like, oh, I get to control my exposure. But the reality is like most people go out in the backcountry to go ski and ride fun terrain. And that fun terrain is often where that's where avalanches happen. So just recognizing that like we are choosing to take that risk, and that we can also learn from past accidents. In the risk management video, I basically pulled out a handful of trends or patterns we see in accidents. And then the goal is to try to give you tools based off of those patterns that are useful. Um, but before we dive into those, I just wanted to kind of make a note about like the human factor. Um, so essentially with these field courses, like we want to introduce the the concepts of what avalanches are, introduce you to some tools like avalanche forecasts if you're not already familiar with them. Um, and then also give you some kind of I guess ways of making decisions that don't rely like on your human bias. And here's kind of the big list of them. So I think what we hope to teach people is that instead of falling back on like, I'm watching somebody else ski the slope, so it must be a good decision, is you actually get like some tier one data or some bullseye data, as we call it, to make the decisions about how much risk you're taking for yourself rather than just following somebody else or making a kind of decision making shortcut like, you know, the last time I was here nothing bad happened, because that's not really like rooted in the reality of the snowpack for that day and the weather for that day. That's kind of a shortcut that we make. So yeah, I mean, I think you could talk about the different ways that humans make decisions that aren't great for them. Like you could talk about that for a whole nother class. We just kind of want to address it and then move on to the patterns that we see and then some actual tools we want to use to keep ourselves a bit safer. So these kind of factors that we see, the kind of main one we see is people who are missing kind of crucial avalanche rescue gear. And I know that sounds like, oh man, that's such an easy thing to do right. But we just keep seeing it happening where there's somebody whose beacon got turned off, or they didn't know how to use their beacon effectively, or they're not actually prepared to perform a rescue. And that could be as simple as I have a slide from Alexis's presentation that's about avalanche rescue, where we have this pattern of multiple people being caught in an avalanche, in the same avalanche, and not being able to perform an effective rescue. So part of that can also be like not having a good plan or there being bad communication in the group, like where someone in the group saw a red flag or saw a sign of instability and didn't say anything or just thought everyone else saw it. So kind of the next step would be like the next factor we're seeing is like not really aware of the severity of the hazard. And that could be as kind of like on the front end is not even looking at an avalanche forecast or missing those obvious signs of instability or underestimating the consequences of an avalanche. And that's actually a theme I think that I see in a lot of accidents and that professionals see in a lot of accidents is people not recognizing that they're in avalanche terrain or they're in an avalanche runout zone. There was a really sad accident, I think 3 years ago, 4 years ago now, down in Utah, where multiple people were buried in an avalanche. And I don't think that the all of the people caught in this avalanche were really aware of how dangerous the terrain they were in was, because a handful of them weren't on a steep slope. They were just underneath a steep slope. And so something like that is really that's a really sad accident. And a lot of these accidents are these are obviously devastating for people. And like we're just trying to learn what we can while being respectful to the fact that like some of these accidents people get really injured or die in. Oh, yeah, you have a question. Ask you to unmute.
Yeah. This thing with like not having multiple people on a slope at a time. I've been like kind of curious about. I heard like Mark's talk at the snow and avalanche workshop about being effectively alone
Hmm.
and like not being like on a hazardous slope at the same time. But I feel like everywhere you go, like that's just a common practice. Like everyone always skins together. If
Hmm.
you're in a popular zone, there's always like multiple groups like on a given slope and like so many people within the same hazardous zone. It's like how does that really work? I feel like
Yeah,
it's such common practice to not do that.
I so I think it's something we're seeing more and more frequently as backcountry skiing and riding's gotten more popular. And I think ultimately we're seeing people using really lazy habits where, depending on the snowpack you live in, it may be totally safe to skin in avalanche terrain and go uphill in avalanche terrain or even be underneath slide paths. But in the type of snowpack we have up here in Southwest Montana, it's really dangerous to be skinning in avalanche terrain. So like when you're on the downhill, you have a lot of vulnerability factors in your favor. You're moving faster. It's easier to get off a slope. You could self arrest if an avalanche happens and you're near the top of it. But if you're skinning, you're really exposed. And like the best practice is to not go uphill in avalanche terrain if you can avoid it or have a really good reason for being on a steep slope while you're skinning. And that good reason could be, it's low avalanche danger. There haven't been recent avalanches for weeks, and you're trying to go ski a steep slope, and you want to know if the snow is safe to actually ski on, like if it's ice or not. Like that's a really good reason to be going uphill with a group on a steep slope. But like you couldn't take that same scenario where it's like I want to go skin up this steep slope and it's January and the avalanche danger is considerable. Like that's just not a good decision for people to be making. They should not be on the steep slope if an avalanche is likely to be triggered by a human that day. And I think like why people kind of increasingly are skinning on steep slopes is because they're seeing other people doing it without anything bad happening. And I think when we have a snowpack that has persistent weak layers, it's not necessarily going to be the first person or the first 10 people that trigger that avalanche. And if you take those habits that use one day on a low hazard day and you use those on a high hazard day, those habits are going to kill you. And so like we want people to recognize what the best travel habits are, and then they can loosen those up as dictated by the conditions. Does that kind of help answer your question? I don't know. It's a really good
Yeah,
question.
that helps. Thank you.
Yeah, and I do think it's just something we've seen increasingly. And it's not just the snowmobilers that are like having multiple people being buried in the same avalanche. It's like skiers and snowboarders too. And part of it is kind of a breakdown of those good travel habits. And like I'll finish my rant here, but those good travel habits just take a lot of discipline, and it takes being creative and maybe having different uphill routes than a standard skin track if you don't like where that skin track goes. Like if a well-established skin track goes on a steep slope and you don't want to be on the steep slope that day based on the information you have, you need to go set a new one. And that's just a decision you're going to have to make for yourself with your group based on the knowledge you have. Well, that was a great question. Thanks for asking. Cool. Okay, so these are just kind of the major factors, and we'll kind of move into like what we introduced to you in this video series is just um having a process to help you manage risk. And like I think when we bring up these factors that cause accidents, a lot of them can seem really basic. And the solution can also be really basic, like as simple as having a system to always read the forecast or look at the weather forecast to make a plan for your trip, even if it's as simple as a phone call where you're like, oh, did you read the avalanche forecast? This is the area we want to go to. What kind of terrain do we want to avoid today? Like it could be as simple as that. And using the information you have from the forecast and your group's ability. So it's like a combo of like your group's ability, the weather forecast, the avalanche forecast, like what your goals are for the day. And it doesn't need to be like a spreadsheet for a trip plan. Like it can be a really simple plan, but you want to base that plan on the best information you can get. And so we'll kind of break this process down into the couple major components. So I already talked a little bit about what we do before we go, but it's getting the forecast, having a plan, having the right gear for what you're getting up to that day. So what we glean from the forecast is like, okay, what's the problem? What are they like? What are we seeing in observations? How does the weather change the avalanche hazard or the instability of the snow? And I know like the way that the GNFAC represents their forecasts is like you have to read all the way through it. They have all these awesome clickable links. If you like see a word that you're like, I don't know what that means, or like, I don't know what they're talking about, they often hyperlink the forecast. If you go to another region, you might see a more visual forecast style that has all the same components in it, where they talk about the avalanche problem type, they talk about where it is, how likely you are to trigger an avalanche, that kind of stuff. So a lot of the same information is there, regardless of the forecast operation and the way that they choose to show their forecast on with their product. So I think like the value in GNFAC's product is like the videos that the conditions videos they put out, and the observations page is like a really good resource for people to see what's going on out there. And then ultimately using the travel advice in the forecast to avoid, like in your trip plan, try to avoid being in those areas that, you're worried about triggering avalanches. So like if it's a considerable hazard, that's going to be, you're likely to trigger an avalanche, versus moderate is it's possible, and like actually reading where the problem is. And a lot of times with our persistent weak layers in our snowpack, like people will get really kind of tired of just hearing, oh, it's still moderate, but we haven't seen very many avalanches. But around here, that might be because there aren't people putting themselves on steep slopes. So we may just not have information about, how unstable it is on any given slope. So I think that can be really challenging for the users of our forecast, because we can have a really dangerous snowpack up here. So yeah, we're taking this information and we're trying to make a plan for the day. And we want to, like I was saying, we want to base that on our group and reality and what we see is going on. And it can be a really simple plan, but we want to make sure it's a plan that's easy to follow. And I think what's really important is having enough navigational skills. And like, unfortunately, due to the scope of this course, we just like can't teach you navigational skills in a day, on top of all the avalanche skills. But being able to recognize avalanche terrain and avoid that in practice is like maybe the #1 tool you have to keep yourself safe. So just a plug for, being able to read maps and being able to read terrain as a skill that you can learn and get better at over time. Cool. So we have our forecast, we have our plan. We're going to make sure everyone has the right gear. So, maybe not every day out you're carrying all of the gear in this picture. Like if you're just going for a dog walk up Brackett Creek Road or going up Goose Creek, you're probably not going to be like carrying your big first aid kit or your big puffy jacket, but you essentially want to have enough stuff for the worst case scenario that's reasonable to carry. And if you're going to be anywhere near avalanche terrain, best practice is beacon shovel probe. So a lot of us are used to carrying these things, like especially if you ski at Bridger Bowl, you're used to carrying a beacon anyways. What we're looking for in a beacon is a modern digital 3 antenna beacon. Pretty much any beacon on the market currently hits those criteria. We kind of want people to follow the manufacturer's recommendation for how long a beacon can last. It's going to depend on the manufacturer. If you notice that your beacon is not behaving correctly, or there's like a crack in the screen, it's an essential like life-saving tool, and it's worth maybe sending into the manufacturer, or following their recommendation for their warranties or recalls or that kind of stuff. Like I know with my beacons, I do software updates on them annually for my BD beacon, and then the Mammoth beacon, it's just when they recommend I have software updates. So it's like a very expensive tool that can save your life. So you really want to make sure to read those user manuals and know how to use your beacon. And for this course, like this is a great opportunity, first time of the year, to get out and use your beacon and ask lots of questions. As far as probes, it's like any probe you could find in a store is probably great. Like we generally recommend people use probes over 240 centimeters. Most probes on the market are 240, 280, 300 centimeters. You just don't like probes, not the thing you skimp on. Don't go ultralight. And similar with shovels, we just want a metal shovel. Ideally, like the extendable handles are a nice feature in a shovel. But yeah, the kind of gear, the best possible gear is the gear that you know how to use. And then yeah, just the plug for, are you prepared for the worst? Like there's so many things you can carry with you, but you can't bring everything. Most people don't want to be out in the backcountry like this search and rescue team, like carrying a 60, 70 liter pack. So it's like just optimizing what you like carrying and what you feel like is essential. And our field courses are a great opportunity to ask our instructors what they're carrying and take a look at it. You'll find a lot of us have probably bigger backpacks than your average day out skiing. But for these courses, that's because we're, as instructors, we're responsible for the safety of the people in our groups. But I think most people will find over time, like they have gear that they like that serves multiple purposes, and can, it's like you have incidents or things happen over time and you like start carrying different gear because of that. You're like, oh, I really wish I had that, like ski multi-tool that helps me adjust this part of a binding. Or if you're a split boarder, carrying the extra screws with you because you've lost some screws and your bindings couldn't stay on your board properly or something like that. So lots of different stuff to prepare for. And yeah, I think Alexis put it really well. Like really with all of this risk management stuff, it's just about having a system. So like one of my old coworkers, when I worked as a ski guide, on his car, like I guess like on the front of his car, inside his car, he like had a list that was his like must bring list. And he would just check it every morning to make sure he had everything that he wanted to have. And it was like, oh, I got my beacon shovel probe, skis, boots, skins, poles, just like having a checklist can be really nice so you don't forget things. That kind of stuff. And yeah, like confirming your gear with your group members ahead of time, and then doing a trailhead check that is as simple as like running through your checklist of the stuff you're bringing with you, and then checking to make sure that your beacons can all search for a signal. They all have battery, they can search for a signal, and they're in transmit when you head out. And that's what we'll teach you in the field days, is the best way to do that beacon check. And that's just because like this tool will only save your life or your partner's life if it's turned on and it's working properly. So big plug for the gear and the trailhead checks. Does anyone have any questions on this, like kind of in this part of the risk management process, the like before you go, or gear? See if we got any in the chat. Questions. So yeah, then in the next kind of component here, it's like we've done our before trip, now we're out in the field. And I do really think because the scope of this course, there's only so much we can cover. And like I really do, I think the GNFAC feels strongly that like a place we can really impact the safety of our users and students is by reinforcing these good travel habits. And a foundation for this is being able to recognize avalanche terrain, and then being able to kind of develop a sense for like, what's my room for error? I think with the reality being that like humans are fallible and make mistakes, even professionals make mistakes. We're talking about like mistakes interpreting if a slope is steep enough to slide, or you know, say you have an understanding what the snowpack's like, but you're a bit wrong, or you missed something, or you didn't feel how wind affected the snow was. It's like, how much room have you built into your plan for the fact that you're going to make mistakes? And that's this whole concept of a margin for error. Um, and the idea with that being like, have you built in places to catch yourself if you do make a mistake? So say back to the, you know, you missed how like wind affected some snow was. And as you're going up a slope, you start feeling that the wind, like the wind affected snow is much punchier and starts feeling slabby. Like, have you given yourself an option to avoid being in avalanche terrain? Or do you need to reassess and change the type of terrain that you're in based on the information that you have? And hopefully you don't box yourself into a corner where you don't have options or choices that could reduce your exposure. I think that's what we really want to be teaching our students. The other component of this is kind of back to Paul's question that was really good, is like, are you protecting yourself and your group from the consequences of an avalanche with good habits? And that's as simple as one at a time on a slope. I think in reality, maintaining good visual contact with your group is really difficult. Like if you're in steep terrain or treed terrain or terrain that like rolls and undulates, like that can actually be really hard to do. And you just have to move slower, and you have to be diligent and work your way up to more complex terrain. Like starting with, you know, in the beginning of your backcountry journey, like starting by avoiding avalanche terrain and working on how you move a group with your group through an area where you can all see each other. Because ultimately, like if you're in avalanche terrain and you can't see one of your partners, you don't know if they're safe or not. And so like this really big plug, like what Mark Staples, our director, was talking about at MSU Saw this year, is just like, how can we travel in a way that protects us and ensures that we could be ready to perform a rescue if we're going to be traveling in avalanche terrain? And like I guess our position as an organization is like, we're not here to tell you all not to go in avalanche terrain. Like we're just trying to give you tools to make good choices for yourself out there. So yeah, that's kind of like the good travel habit foundation. And like why we spend so much time talking about this is because the data kind of supports, unfortunately, this reality that we have some unsafe travel practices that cause avalanches or make avalanches worse. And yeah, so what this chart shows is just incidents. This isn't just fatalities. So this is all the incidents that had incident reports on MT Avalanche's avalanche database from the last 11 years. And 50% of those accidents involved multiple people being caught in an avalanche. And I do think that this is like an area that people can really affect the outcome by making different travel decisions. And oftentimes it just requires moving more slowly, which is hard for people. Like we're kind of, you know, people are used to like go, go, go. And it's hard advice to follow to just slow down. But it can really change the outcome of an avalanche if you have two people caught in it. Like the chances of both people surviving is a lot lower if you have multiple burial. So it's really worth taking the time to learn good travel practices. Yeah, I'm gonna unmute you again for question.
What do you mean by by just slowing down and like moving slower, do you mean just like taking the time to think about things, or do you mean like
Yeah.
in a pit, or
No,
what's
like
like the
like
benefit?
physically moving slower at like transitions. Say you're about to go ski a slope. Have you actually talked about where you're meeting up and regrouping? Did you think about those on your way up? Like if you happen to ski up adjacent, like you're touring up adjacent to a slope you want to ski down and it's avalanche terrain, have you identified how you're going to move through that avalanche terrain? Like actually taking the time to be like, this is what we're going to do, and this is where we're going to regroup. And then when you're in the terrain, like being able to be like, okay, this is like my escape off this steep slope because I looked at it earlier, or I was able to, see the slope earlier. And like, this is, cutting over off this slope. So it's like just actually taking the time to develop those good practices. And I do think slowing down and like digging a pit is always a great thing, but it's more like your actual like movement in the mountains. And I think these days, like, not to shame like people who move fast and light, but we have this whole era of ski mountaineering and moving really fast. And I think sometimes when you choose to move really fast, you're substituting a bit of your group's safety, by not having as many of those conversations, or maybe not being as intentional with how you're moving people through a piece of avalanche terrain. I hope that answers your question a bit. So yeah, these good travel habits aren't going to be learned in a single day or from a single course. It's kind of like a lifelong pursuit where we get better at it the more we practice it, and the more that we learn what works well for us and our groups in certain terrain or conditions or things like that. Yeah, and so the other component of like the actual in the field risk management that we taught you all in this lecture series is recognizing red flags. And this is like when we think back to the start of this risk management recap. When we think about how to de-bias ourselves, so we have this human factor bias of these like different ways we make decisions, and red flags are like the tier one, or like the data that's the most rooted in objective reality. And these are the signs of instability. And so nothing you see like in a snow pit, or nothing you saw in an avalanche forecast is going to trump red flags. Red flags are like the obvious signs of instability. And those are going to be what you want to rely on in the field to dial back your exposure to avalanche terrain. And that's going to be seeing recent avalanches, cracking, collapsing, lumping. So basically an avalanche without a steep enough slope. A lot of recent snow. So the indicator we use is over an inch of water in 24 hours. You can also use snowing more than an inch an hour for 6 hours. So just heavy snowfall or a lot of recent snow. Anytime it rains too, that's going to be a big destabilizer. We don't see that as often around here where I'm from. In the Central Sierra, we would get rain on snow pretty frequently. So it just depends on where you're recreating. So the other really big red flag is going to be windblown snow. Oh, we'll see if that video didn't want to play. And yeah, just being able to notice and see wind affected snow. And so like a day like with windblown snow, that's really aspect dependent. And so you're not going to see windblown snow on every aspect most likely. So you might just need to choose a different aspect that day. Same with this rapid warming. If the rapid warming is due to just the sun's impact on the slope, you may just need to find a shady slope, or a slope where the sun hasn't melted the surface of the snow yet. So it could be really aspect dependent that you're seeing these red flags, or it could be on all aspects. And so that's just going to change our decision making on any given day of like where we're seeing these red flags and what our tools to avoid, or what our plan at the start of the day was to avoid those slopes that have red flags on them. So we really want you to default to using these red flags as a way to dial it back. And a big plug, like we didn't talk about snow pits as a decision-making tool in the pre-recorded material of this course. We will show you a demo pit tomorrow, or not tomorrow, in the field sessions, we'll show you demo pits. And I just wanted to address that with this Q&A, is like snowpack observations in the absence of red flags, we have to go look in the snow to see what the forecasters are talking about and to confirm like, oh, is that what's going on in the snowpack here? But in Erica's video, she talked about spatial variability, like, so how much snow changes over the mountainside and over mountain ranges. And a snow pit is one piece of information from one location. Snow pits are really useful as a forecasting tool when you dig a lot of them repeatedly. They're not intended to be used as a single, like, go, no-go decision-making tool. They can be a really good tool, like if you see weak snow or you see, you know, a propagating extended column test, for example. Like that's the test that we'll show you all how to do, because that's a test that's used really frequently by the Gallatin National Forest Avalanche Center. So if you're seeing unstable results, that's a great reason to dial it back or to be a no for a slope, a steep slope. But it shouldn't be the only piece of data you're basing a decision off of, just because the limitations of a single pit in a single location. And oftentimes in Southwest Montana, like people are skiing in areas that don't have very many observations, or don't have very many data points, or are skiing even in unforecasted areas. And digging pits is a great way to learn more about what's going on in the snowpack, but they really shouldn't be used as a single decision-making, like as the only decision-making point. You should be factoring in things like red flags or the weather, or pits dug over multiple different times out in that area for like, especially for an area where you haven't been skiing or riding in. And like most recreationalists do not want to spend all their time in a snow pit. And snow pits are a great place to learn a lot about the snowpack. But they're not the only decision-making tool that we have. And that's why we didn't really touch on them in this pre-course material. The only other plug I'm going to make is that observations are really useful to the GNFAC. And it's really easy to submit an observation, and they don't need to be scientific, and they don't need to be professional. Even letting the GNFAC know, like, oh, the skiing was good in this area, and there was 6 inches of new snow, or like there was boot top new snow. Like that's all they need to know, really. Or I skied in this zone, saw an avalanche. Here's a picture of it. We really like to know when people have seen avalanches or when people have triggered avalanches. And those can even be fully anonymous. So just a plug for that. Does anyone have any questions about kind of the decision-making topic before I move into our final one, which is going to be rescue? Okay. Yeah, I think we're going to just accelerate into rescue. We'll talk a little bit about debriefing during the classroom session. And yeah, I think that to recap, like the real goal with teaching you all about systems to manage risk and avalanche risk management is that, like, we really just want to get out and have a fun day with our friends and family and be able to keep doing that. And so we often need to use systems to help keep ourselves in line, and help us make good choices. So yeah, with rescue, it's the last recap of this, just because it's kind of like what we do when things go wrong. Like, hopefully we've taken a lot of steps already to keep ourselves safer. And Alexis's quote, it's a lot easier to stay out of trouble than get out of trouble. So we really teach you all of these other ways to reduce risk for yourself before we show you avalanche rescue. So we'll get a lot of practice with avalanche rescue in the field, and it's really the only, like, it's one of the few things that we can just keep practicing, and we like very tangibly get better at the more we practice. So yeah, the user groups who are caught in avalanches, this is a combo of caught and killed in Southwest Montana over the last 11 years. And it's just a really interesting data set. It looks a little bit different than the national data set, mostly because on the national level, we categorize people into way smaller segments. And oftentimes it's looked like the data is way skewed, like there's way more snowmobile accidents than all the other users, but it's actually because all the other users are broken into smaller categories. So we really intentionally kept only a few categories, and it shows kind of like that avalanches are equal opportunity killers. We have a lot of skiers and a lot of snowmobilers who are caught in avalanches, and that's reflected in the number who are killed as well. I think in Montana, historically, we've had a lot of snowmobile avalanche fatalities because we have really good motorized access in Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. And recently, the kind of backcountry skiing's exploded, so we've seen a lot more accidents in recent years with skiers. So yeah, that's just the local data set, and this is just pulled from mtavalanche.com. If you're interested in like the stats for avalanche fatalities, the Colorado Avalanche Information Center, CAIC, they host the national data set, and that's all for like available on their website. It's pretty interesting to take a look at. So these survival rates, why we show this graph in all of our classes is to really hit home that your best chance of survival is going to be getting dug up in 15 minutes. And the only way that you can accomplish that is if your partners see you when you're caught in the avalanche and respond immediately. And even if they do those things, it's not a guarantee they're going to get to you this quickly. And there are people who can live a lot longer than 15 minutes or 40 minutes. It just depends on if they have an air pocket or not. Most people are dying in avalanches in the US from asphyxiation, so rebreathing their own CO2. And then about 30% of people are dying due to traumatic injuries. So what are you going to do if you're caught in an avalanche? I think this is like really important stuff to keep in mind. I had a coworker a couple years ago who taught an avalanche rescue course to a group that included someone who'd been caught and buried in an inbounds avalanche at Silver Mountain in Idaho. And the person who was caught in this avalanche remembered what he'd heard in an avalanche class about how, after you're done swimming and fighting in the avalanche, you should try to throw a hand in front of your face to protect your airway. And this person was actually able to have a bigger air pocket around them because of that choice. And it's hard to say if that's the reason this person survived, but they were able to survive. I think it was something like a 40-minute burial. And this was at inside a ski area. It was a pretty incredible incident that was a fatal incident for other people involved. But it's like these kind of steps will actually help you survive if you're caught in an avalanche. So if you have an avalanche airbag, like when you have triggered the avalanche and the snow starts moving, it is time to pull that airbag. It doesn't matter if you end up being able to stop yourself on the slope or ski off the slope. Like, you only have one shot really to pull an airbag, and you should just take it right away. Alexis had some pretty interesting data points about airbags as well. And yeah, you may not actually have time to think about getting your skis off your feet. You really just don't want to have like your pole loops around your hands, because those are just going to be things that will like rip your hands away from you and injure your shoulders. Avalanches are going to be a really violent event. You're not going to have very much control over what's going on around you. And the whole idea of creating an air pocket is just as the snow is setting up, is just trying to like clear your mouth of snow or make room in front of your mouth just to give you more air to work with. But you may not have the ability to do that. And that's kind of like the stay calm component is like once you're caught in an avalanche, you're really out of control of the situation. And like that's when you're going to be like, okay, my partners know what to do. They're going to come and get me. And you'll most likely pass out. And your partners are hopefully going to come and get you. Does anyone have any questions on like what to do if you're caught in an avalanche? I think that's a common area we see for questions. It is really going to depend on like where you are on the slope. So if you're on the top of where an avalanche is being, like you've triggered an avalanche, you're at the very top of it, your best case scenario is going to be to stop yourself and let the snow all move down below you. Only the snow on top of you can bury you. So only the snow above you can bury you. So really trying to traverse off a slope or get off a slope or stop yourself before you go down the slope is going to be the best case scenario. And that's like the question about skinning. Like if you are skinning and you're caught in an avalanche, you just have so much less control and you have so many fewer options, which is why we really want people to not be skinning in avalanche terrain. Okay. So the stages of companion rescue, we're going to just run through these really quick. I don't want us to go over the hour and a half. And we're going to get way more practice with this in the field. Like avalanche rescue is not the type of thing that is like best learned on Zoom or like from YouTube. It's like much better to just practice in person with trained instructors who can coach you on technique. But the important steps here are going to be, someone taking control of the situation. And if you're in a group looking around and you're like, who's in charge? Like, it's probably you. You're going to be in charge because you're the one who has the situational awareness to recognize you need a leader. You have the search. You're going to have, so that's going to be your signal search, course search, find search. We'll show you how to do all those steps in the field day. And then pinpointing with a probe and then shoveling. And shoveling is going to be the most time consuming part, maybe other than an evacuation. And it's really important to recognize like once an avalanche has happened, there could be traumatic injuries. This could be a really difficult patient to deal with once you have them on the surface. This person might not be breathing. They might not have a pulse. They could have bleeding or injuries. And being able to have some basic first aid training can go a really long way because it can help you recognize what's an emergency and going to kill someone quickly versus like maybe you have a little bit more time and you don't need to evacuate right away or you don't need to be calling 911 right away. But essentially like an avalanche is going to be an emergency every time because this person doesn't have an airway and that is going to kill them pretty quickly. So when we think about the stages of this search, I just pulled up two kind of examples. So I think the classic way to think about it is you're going top down and you have a last seen point at the top of the slope. And you need to cover that slope until you pick up a signal. The kind of other way to think about this is say you have a last seen point and you're actually at the bottom of the slope. You already went down the slope, your friend's going down it now, and your last seen point is somewhere in the middle of the slope. And you need to cover from the bottom up the debris. And so you can choose to do that by splitting up, if you have multiple people, kind of splitting up the segment. And you're going to do your signal search based off, I'm going to go back to the prior slide. You're going to do that signal search based off the range of your beacon. So most beacons have a range of 45 to 70 meters. And so we recommend that you just have your range, and that's like the cross section you'd make across the slope. So you're not going to miss a signal because at this point you're just looking for a signal. So you have kind of two different strategies there depending on where you are on the slope, where the person was. Are they above you? Are they below you? It's just going to be situationally dependent. The signal search goal is the same, to get a signal as fast as possible, as safely as possible. Because you're not going to be an effective rescuer if you injure yourself. So we'll cruise through that. So we have a signal. Now we're just following the arrows and numbers. And then once we get close, we want to slow down. So the find search is going to be, how do we find the lowest possible number? There's not a magic number. It's just what's the lowest possible number as quickly as possible. And that's going to be using the find search technique we show you, where you travel just on an X and a Y axis. And then once you have that lowest possible value, that's when you're going to get the probe and the shovel out. And once you have the lowest possible value on your beacon, the beacon's no longer as useful. You need to put the beacon away, get the probe and the shovel out. And probing, you may not get a probe strike right away. You may need to do some strategic probing, and your spacing should be about 10 inches. I use like my foot as an approximation. A human's pretty big. You just want to make sure you're not going to miss them in your probe pattern. And then shoveling, the goal is to get to the airway and create a platform to work with. And it's going to depend on the number of people you have and how difficult the snow is going to be to move. And shoveling is going to be by far the hardest part of the rescue. So these are kind of some common challenges we see with rescue. And hopefully in taking classes, you get the right technique so you can go practice more on your own to feel really confident in your ability to use the tools you have to perform a rescue. Yeah, and that's, I think, the main challenge we can help people address through our courses. Okay, so yeah, just a final plug, like these are emergencies, and we just want to give you tools to be able to respond better in an emergency. Okay, so that is the whole recap. I know it took a bit longer than I expected, but does anyone have any other questions? I'm just going to see if I'm missing anything. Oh, here we go. Okay, so the question is positive probe strike between the ground and a human. So we'll get some practice with that in the field, but the ground, even when it's frozen, you can like push a probe into. A human is going to be bouncy. It's going to rebound. Even if you hit a ski boot and it kind of glances off the boot, if you probe near that and hit their leg, it's going to have a rebound. So you're also looking for the height difference. Like if you're close, if the debris is shallow enough that you can go all the way to the ground, you're going to feel a difference in height if you hit a buried object. So it's going to be based off the feel and the height of the buried person. So there's kind of two ways. So after a burial, here's the other question. Should rescuers descend one at a time or all at once and ski down the track or skirt the sides? So the safest possible place after an avalanche is going to be where the avalanche has run. So the track of the avalanche, because that snow is very unlikely to slide again. The only reason you wouldn't send every single person down to start a rescue is if you were worried about an additional overhead avalanche, where you may want to say have some like one person stay off the slope as a spotter. If that's how complicated your situation is, like that's really going to be really difficult. But generally, you want all your resources to help with a rescue. If you have enough people with you, you may consider having someone stay up at the top if there's like cell phone service by ridge lines, or someone to hit SOS on an inReach. So it's just going to depend on the number of people you have in your group. But generally, like the most immediate concern is getting that person an airway. Yeah, that's a great question. Those of you who asked those questions, let me know if you have kind of like an additional follow-up. Those are great questions. And yeah, I'll open it up to if there's questions back about the field day again. And I'll just kind of keep the call going for a couple more minutes. Yeah, I think the emails should have the waiver link if you haven't filled that out, and the gear list. So like I have gotten emails from people if they do have questions about the gear, like feel free to reach out. We don't want like the equipment to be an obstacle to take this course. So like while we recommend you have your own beacon to practice with, like we do have some loaners or can hook you up with getting a rental or something like that. Follow-up question is, are there beacon parks in Bozeman? Yes, they're probably not up yet because there isn't enough snow. So the Friends of GNFAC puts up a beacon park at Story Mill when there's enough snow. So the Story Mill Community Park, and then MSU puts a park in near the outdoor rec building by Granny's Donuts. And then Bridger Bowl and Big Sky both have beacon parks. There will also be one down in West Yellowstone. So there's a handful of beacon parks in the kind of greater Gallatin region. Good question. I don't think any of them are active yet. Well, I don't want people to stay any longer than the promised hour and a half. So that is the recap. And I'll stay on for a couple more minutes if people have questions specifically about the field day. But thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you this weekend. Oh, yeah, that's a great question. Resources for snowpack not covered by MT Avalanche. So there really isn't like a specific resource for that. Like MT Avalanche hosts, GNFAC hosts like an observations platform for like the Beaverhead Deer Lodge area outside of Dillon. But other than that, there's not like a concentrated resource for these other ranges. You can look at info on the NRCS SNOTEL sites. Like that's a way to get a gauge for snowpack depth in some areas. But we do really live in a super data sparse state. So like unless other people other people on the call have bits of info, like it's, I've been recreating outside of Bozeman for about 14 years, and there really aren't resources like, for example, for the Absorka or the Crazies. You really just have to go in there and take a look. So sorry, I can't be more helpful than that, Brandon. Ooh, we do not have merch right now. That's a good question. And ways to support. So we are currently doing our fall fundraising campaign. That's a great way to contribute right now. And right now, we're not really offering any ways to volunteer. You can always reach out to the friends of GNFAC at gmail.com. And as we have time or opportunities come up, we can always reach back out to people. But right now, we don't really have volunteer opportunities, at least at this time of the season. But supporting, I think the easiest way to support is just sharing with your like community and your backcountry partners that we're currently doing a fundraising campaign. And there's information about that on our website and forecasts. Sweet. And then I wanted to just follow up. Julius, are you still on the call? Did you find a ride, or do you need me to send an email? No, still not sure if he found a ride. Well, I'll copy your email and send it out to people who are going to be there on Sunday. Well, thanks all for tuning in. I'll keep it going for a couple more minutes if people have questions. And feel free to pop a question in the chat or raise your hand if you have a question. And I'm going to stop my screen share. Stop the recording.